Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a story that's really at the heart of the Philippines, a story about land. It's a struggle that's been going on for centuries, and it's often been violent. You know, this quote right here, it really just hits the nail on the head. It tells us something crucial. If you want to understand rural poverty in the Philippines, you can't just look at today's economy. You have to go way back. This is all a legacy of colonialism. It's about history, power, and a conflict that has truly defined the nation. So let's unpack that. This is a struggle that has literally defined the country for centuries. It's fueled rebellions, it's been the centerpiece of presidential campaigns, and it still impacts millions of lives right now. So the big questions are, how did this all start? And maybe more importantly, why is it still going on? All right, to really get this, we have to start at the very beginning. We need to understand the one massive change that basically lit the fuse on this whole conflict. Let's talk about why land is everything in this story. Okay, so look at this. The difference here is just night and day. Before the Spanish arrived, land wasn't something you bought or sold. It was communal. Sure, there were social classes, and that decided who got to use the land, but nobody really owned it in the way we think of it today. Then boom, the Spanish show up and flip the entire script. They introduce this totally foreign idea of private ownership, declare all land the property of the Spanish king, and start handing out huge chunks of it to their friends. I mean, this was a complete game changer. And this is how that old system worked, right? You had your nobles, your freemen, and your dependents. Freemen could farm the land, but they had to kick back a portion of their crops to the local chief, the datu. But the key takeaway here, the thing you have to remember, is that the whole idea of a piece of paper, a legal title that said, this land is mine to sell, that just didn't exist. So this shift from land for the community to land for the crown, it wasn't just a change in philosophy. It created a legal framework, a system, that was perfectly designed to take land away from the people who had been working it forever. So how did they actually do it? Well, it was tragically simple, really. The Spanish government started issuing decrees saying, hey, everyone needs a legal title for their land. But think about it. The average farmer had no idea what that even meant. They didn't understand the paperwork, the deadlines, the bureaucracy. And what happened when they didn't comply? Their land was forfeited. It was taken by the state. And just like that, you have farmers who become renters on the very same land their families had farmed for generations. It's heartbreaking. And let's be clear, this wasn't an accident or some kind of paperwork mix-up. This was the system working as intended. Huge estates, these haciendas, were handed over to Spanish elites and to the religious friars. This created massive resentment, a whole new class of landless peasants, and it became one of the main drivers, a huge reason, for the Philippine Revolution. So at its heart, that revolution was a fight for land. But here's the twist in the story. Just as Filipinos were rising up to take back what was theirs, a new player enters the game, America. And suddenly, everything gets a whole lot more complicated. The revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, they knew exactly what they wanted. Their plan was simple: take back the huge estates from the friars. In their eyes, that land had been stolen, and they were going to give it back to the Filipino people. But that plan went up in smoke. The Americans won the Spanish-American War, took control of the Philippines, and Aguinaldo's revolutionary government was defeated. So that dream of land reform, it was dead on arrival. The whole problem with the friar lands just got kicked down the road, starting this whole vicious cycle all over again. Now, the Americans did bring in some new things, like the torrent system for land titles, and they did sell off some of those friar lands, but, and this is a huge but, their main interest was economic. They wanted raw materials for American industries, and who could provide that? The big landowners, the hacienderos. So U.S. policy ended up making the local elite even more powerful. And get this, the number of tenant farmers actually went up. For many peasants, life got even harder. So you get a law like the Rice Tenancy Act in 1933. On the surface, it sounds okay, right? A 50-50 split between the landowner and the tenant? Fair enough. But the landlords were clever. They found a loophole. They started giving tenants contracts for only 1 year. What does that mean? It means they could just kick a farmer off the land for any reason, with no security. It created this constant state of fear and instability. And that brings us into the modern era, after independence. And this is where we get what I call the alphabet soup of agrarian reform. You're about to see a dizzying number of new laws and programs, one after another, each with its own acronym, all supposedly designed to fix this one persistent problem. I mean, just look at this list. From the 40s all the way to the late 80s, every president has their own signature land reform law. You've got RA this, PD that, CARP. It really shows you this has been the issue, the problem that every single leader has had to confront. So let's break a few of these down. First up, President Roxas. His big idea was the Tenant Act, which set up a 70-30 crop sharing deal in favor of the tenant. Sounds better, right? But what's the fundamental problem here? It's still about sharing. It's not about owning. It didn't solve the core problem of landlessness, and believe it or not, things actually got even worse. Okay, then you have President Magsaysay. He was known as a champion of the common man, and his reforms were definitely more ambitious. He pushed for a leasehold system instead of share tenancy, which would give farmers more security. And he even passed a law that let the government buy up huge private estates, anything over 300 hectares, to redistribute. Now that sounds like real progress, doesn't it? Well, hold on. Here we go again. The law was full of loopholes. There was a big one that exempted lands below a certain size, which meant a ton of the big landowners were completely protected. So the law's actual impact? Pretty small. The cycle just kept on turning. All right, next up is President Mako Pagal. He tries to get tougher. His land reform code lowers the maximum amount of land someone can own down to 75 hectares. The plan was for the government to buy the excess land and then sell it to the tenants. Sounds like a good plan, right? But it ran into a huge problem. And here we see a theme that just keeps popping up. The whole thing was a total failure. For 2 years, not one single hectare of land was actually purchased under this program. Why? Simple. There was no money to fund it. And even if there was, the farmers couldn't have afforded to buy the land anyway. It's a tough lesson. Without the money and the political will to back it up, a law is just words on a page. Then we get to the Marcos era. Under martial law, Marcos issues his famous Tenant Emancipation Act. He declared the whole country a land reform area, targeting rice and corn farms. But, you guessed it, there was a catch, a huge one. The decree conveniently exempted lands that were planted with valuable export crops, things like sugar and coconuts. And, wouldn't you know it, that's where some of the biggest and most powerful land-owning families had their fortunes. So after the People Power Revolution topples Marcos, the struggle for real, meaningful land reform is front and center once again. It becomes this massive promise of the new democracy. But as we're about to see, this story, it just doesn't seem to have an ending. So President Cory Aquino launches CARP. This was supposed to be the big one, the most ambitious land reform program ever. But it got bogged down by the same old issues, not enough money, slow implementation. So the next president, Ramos, had to extend it. Then Estrada comes in with his own program. Then Arroyo has to extend CARP again, this time calling it CARPer. You see the pattern? For decades, they just keep extending and tweaking the program. But for millions of farmers, nothing really changes. They're still landless. And all of this leaves us with one big, lingering question. After all this time, after centuries of conflict, after a revolution, after that whole alphabet soup of reforms, why is the simple dream of owning the land you farm still just a dream for so many people? What our source material really drives home is that this was never just about economics. It's a story about power, about justice, and about a fundamental human desire for a place to call your own. A story that, even today, is still being written.